I started investing in uranium in early 2021, and I'm up. So I don't understand. These people are saying I got in 2016 and 2018 and 2020, and they're down. The reason is because they all took a gamble and they rolled the dice on these junior explorers. They had visions of sugar plums dancing in their heads, and they thought they're going to get 100-bagger return, and that it doesn't matter because the uranium thesis is so strong, it's going to generate a mania. And when a mania occurs, anything with uranium in the name is just going to go to the moon. And so I'd rather invest in a stock that costs 10 cents and can go to $1 than a stock that's $5 and could go to 8 or 10.
This is Little by Little with Andy Schechtman.
All right. Welcome back, everybody, to a new episode of Little by Little. I am very psyched to have with me Jesse Day, a guy that I've gotten to know very well over the last couple of years, and one of the best interviewers out in the space. Jesse, thanks for coming on, brother. Good to see you. Happy New Year, man.
Happy New Year to you as well. Very much appreciate you inviting me on the show. We have had a lot of interviews where I'm on the other side of the microphone, so I'm looking forward to being questioned this time.
Yeah, I figured I'd flip the switch and shine the light on you. Where were you on the night of, kind of thing. And so, I'm sure you'll do just fine, but you're someone who has a wealth of information that you bring to every interview, a wealth of insight that you bring to every interview. And I'm going to ask you some questions along those lines. And I'm going to start with your past. I noticed from your jesseday.ca website that you have had a rich career outside of finance. The one thing that caught my eye was that you built a YouTube channel in South Korea with 90,000 subscribers. And you also did 2 travel channels throughout China. And I guess when I read that, the thought that came to my mind more than anything is in your traveling through Asia, China in particular, and South Korea, how do they look at gold? How do they look at the dollar? What do you see happening in China and in South Korea that maybe the people in the West don't realize as it pertains to precious metals?
That's a very interesting question. I did do travel programs extensively, both in China and in South Korea. So traveled a lot around both of those places. Now, it's difficult to answer that question because at that time, I was also asleep to the true value of precious metals and what they were. It actually took the pandemic and the government response to the pandemic to wake me up. So I had very little discussions about gold and silver in those countries. Interestingly, when I did live in Korea, I went down a bit of a rabbit hole. My first introduction to financial markets was through the efficient market hypothesis, Eugene Fama and Kenneth French. I dove deep into that, and that was kind of a bit of the first understandings I had of financial markets. But at that time, I completely divested myself of Canada. I was living in Korea on my own with a very meager amount of capital. There was no free online brokers. This was 2009 approximately. So I had no way to access markets essentially, and I kind of put it out of my mind for some time. So I hate to circumvent your question, but instead what I'd like to do is kind of shed some light on what opened my eyes, and the whole pandemic is really what woke me up. Now, the government response was completely horrific. It's the reason I left Canada and I'm sitting here in Serbia today. But it is one of the greatest things that happened to me in that it completely transformed my perspective and my understanding and made me start to question what money is. And I was working a sales job at the time. It was interesting because I went from the heights of kind of the broadcasting industry in China and Korea, and I came back to Canada and thought I was going to continue that career in Canada, only to find it was a lot harder than I thought it would be. I kind of muddled around in various sales positions, and the pandemic hit and I got laid off of my job and sent home and started getting checks from the government. Now, interestingly, these checks were coming frequently. They were nearly the same amount that I was getting paid to go and do my job. And they were even putting bonuses on top. They go, here's a bonus check. So it really made me start to question, how is this possible? And that led me down the rabbit hole of watching Mike Maloney, The Hidden Secrets of Money documentary, which really opened my eyes. The Creature from Jekyll Island, G. Edward Griffin, I know you've interviewed him, I have as well. Reading through that and just discovering how truly deceptive governments are, because prior to that point, I hadn't been paying attention whatsoever to what my own government was even doing. And then when I saw all the restrictions start to come into place, this forcing of the medical treatment that everybody had to take or you would be outcast from society, you couldn't get a job, all of these sorts of things really gave me pause. And that's kind of what started my journey in terms of starting my own channel, because I discovered silver first, because that just fascinated me. At the time, I didn't have enough money to buy gold. So, silver being the poor man's gold, I started stacking silver. And it was just such an amazing feeling to take money into my own hands completely free of counterparty risk, which to this day, I think is the most valuable aspect of both gold and silver. Just being able to take my wealth and hold it in my own hands. And it's not, once you make that transformation, you realize how shocking it is that the vast majority of people have 100% of their wealth tied up in counterparty risk to a bank, to a broker, whether you're holding stocks, bonds, any financial asset outside of precious metals in your own possession. You are trusting very often the establishment. And when we look at what happened in Canada, when Justin Trudeau froze the bank accounts, all he had to do was make a phone call to those banks and say, hey, I need you to freeze these people's bank accounts. And they said, yes, sir, right away. And they did it. So to trust your money with those sorts of institutions entirely is insanity to me. And that kind of woke me up to the true value of gold and silver, which I believe is storing your wealth outside of counterparty risk, untraceable, untrackable, in your own possession.
Yeah, it's a huge point. One that's not talked about enough with the virtues of precious metals. In fact, to me, I agree. It's pretty close to point number one. And when you realize, put it in the context of David Rogers Webb, the book, The Great Taking, or even the reasoning that Janet Yellen told the senator from Oklahoma in the inquiry on the House, why they bailed out Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, when indeed the Dodd-Frank Act has made that illegal. Instead, should have been bailed in, and the depositors like Oprah and the tech startups in Silicon Valley, they should have been bailed in. They were illegally bailed out according to the Dodd-Frank Act that says you're an unsecured general creditor, anything over the $250,000 FDIC limit. And she said, we bailed it out because we believed it was an uber majority vote of myself, the FOMC, the FDIC, and the president, that the risks were too systemic. And so hanging on to things in your own possession, I agree with you. And I'm glad that you brought that up, which kind of leads me to the next question. And selfishly enough, as someone who's kind of dabbled, as you may see here, in interviewing others rather than being interviewed, I think what the question I want to ask you will dovetail nicely into maybe advice for the average investor, a path that you seem to have followed on your own. My question is, how do you prepare for interviews with such a wide variety of experts? And I think that preparation, which opens your eyes to certain things, will be very valuable for people to hear in terms of just gaining knowledge, gaining experience. But when you're interviewing someone like myself, back a couple of years ago, I was blown away by your knowledge base. So my question is, how do you prepare for these interviews, and what can you maybe share with the public? Maybe they can take something away from that and gain some information, really important information, like you did and like you do, for themselves.
That's a really good question. And it started with the fact that I dedicated my life to financial markets once I kind of fully discovered, first of all, starting with sound money in the form of gold and silver, and then moving into the commodities space more broadly, where I became very interested in energy and how energy was generated and the commodities behind that. And I started at the very beginning. What is a stock? I literally didn't know anything. What is a PE ratio? All of these things. And so I first set the foundation for being able to evaluate companies, non-commodities companies. I think this is a bit of a mistake that a lot of people who are new to the commodity space in particular make, is they ignore kind of the classic wisdom, the, Ben Grahams of the world, the Howard Marks, Peter Lynch, Warren Buffett, all of this wisdom about the stock market in general. They look at that and go, that's the broad market. That's a different market that I'm involved in. I'm into gold miners or I'm into uranium. And they don't really gain a base of knowledge when it comes to how the stock market works, how to evaluate a company, how to read financial statements, at least at a basic level, and how to extract the information from those financial statements to then be able to evaluate and compare one company in one category to another. So I think it started there for me. And then in terms of my preparation for interviews, obviously it involves delving into the person I'm interviewing's background and where their expertise is, and trying to ask the questions that I want to know as an investor. That's kind of where I start from. Or in the case of gold and silver, which when we talk about the metals themselves, I don't consider an investment, then I want to ask the questions that I think would inform me the best. And because I'm coming from a bit of a more beginner platform than a lot of other people in this industry, as I only, like I said, discovered gold and silver in 2020, in the midst of the pandemic, I think that those questions that I asked that could potentially serve me are actually a good kind of knowledge base for those who are viewing to also try to understand financial markets and various commodities. So that's how I approach things.
I couldn't agree more, and that's why I wanted to ask that question. I'm sure people would find that perspective enlightening. We're not all born with this knowledge, and it makes me wonder if I'm making the right decision. I've already sent 2 through college, sending my 3rd to college, when a person like yourself has become incredibly articulate, well-read, and very smooth at what you're doing by teaching yourself for the plethora of information that is out there. And, not to mention, you're interviewing some of the brightest minds in finance and in investing and in innovation. And with that in mind, reflecting back on 2024 with all of those people that you spoke to, the Rick Rules of the world, and the smart people who are, reflecting on 3-4 decades worth of experience, what stood out to you the most, whether it was key market trends or insights from your guests or shifts in the commodities space? What stood out to you most in 2024? And I'll dovetail that and say, as we move to 2025, what developments or themes are you most, or your guests, anticipating in the year ahead?
It's a really big question. And first, I would say that the most important thing was more of a mindset, which is, because I speak to such a huge variety of people with different opinions, some of them of whom I disagree with, there's always something useful to be gleaned by speaking to anyone with experience. And it's kind of interesting to me because I notice this a lot in my YouTube comment section, where I see people say, oh, he said this. For example, this guy believes that silver is not manipulated, so I stopped watching as soon as he said that. Or this guy believes man-made climate change is real or not real, or whatever sort of hot button topic that makes people emotional and that they have an opinion on. They're very quick to discount somebody because of that. But I think even in the ravings of a madman, you will find a nugget of truth. So I think you have to keep listening to these people with decades of experience, which is pretty much everybody I listen to. So I think one skill that I've been able to learn is parsing through all of this different information and all of these different opinions, and then applying it to my knowledge base and figuring out what I believe, what I do not believe. If someone's questioning something that I believe, then why? Maybe I'm missing a piece of that puzzle. So I think the greatest thing I took away in 2024 from my plethora of guests was that mindset shift to try to gain a greater understanding through all of this different information. In terms of market trends, particularly I cover the commodities space. Obviously, we're seeing a bifurcation between East and West. I've talked about this a lot with you. We're seeing restriction of resource exports happening to non-friendly nations. This is another big catalyst, I think, for the commodities space. At the end of the day, commodities across the board are extraordinarily undervalued, historically speaking. And I think the one that I would probably point out, because we talk about gold and silver a lot, uranium is probably my biggest conviction and has been since I first started investing in the equity markets. And I still believe that the value proposition presented by uranium is incredible. I've spoken to some incredible guests in 2024, including Justin Hune and Mike Alkin, Lobo Tigre, who are very well-versed, Rick Rule, of course, who are all very well-versed in the uranium industry. And what most people don't realize is that we are in a structural deficit for uranium today. The amount of uranium mined at present is not enough to fuel the world's reactor fleets. Now, you might ask, that doesn't make sense. How are the reactor fleets even operating? That is because of inventory overhangs of uranium that have been around since the Fukushima disaster. You know, when Fukushima happened, the overreaction was absolutely insane from world leaders. In fact, not a single person died due to the Fukushima nuclear reactor accident. There were a few elderly hospital patients who did die, unfortunately, due to being transported very quickly from where they believed that the radiation radius was going to be. But in terms of people who actually died due to the disaster itself, due to radiation from this nuclear plant, it was zero. And yet the world reaction was Japan said, we're shutting down all of our nukes. Countries around the world pledged nuclear energy is extraordinarily dangerous. We have to divest ourselves of it. However, Japan continued to receive their contracted uranium inventories for some time out as they had signed long-term contracts, as did other nuclear plants. This created a large buildup in inventory that is now basically being completely worked through. And then we have vehicles like the Sprott Physical Uranium Trust, which is an ETF that buys and stores physical uranium and basically takes it off the market so it cannot be used in nuclear reactors. And you've got Yellowcake PLC, which is another physical fund that trades on the London Stock Exchange. Same thing, they're buying pounds and storing them. So that has been a big catalyst. And now we have seen a complete 360 when it comes to global attitudes towards nuclear power. It's being embraced now by the most radical, far left-leaning environmentalist with a mental illness, everywhere from there all the way to the far right and everywhere in between. It has become a bipartisan support is there for nuclear energy. We're seeing reactor buildouts all over the world. We're seeing China in particular pledge to build over 100 nuclear reactors within the next 10 to 15 years. We're seeing the UAE. We're seeing countries across Europe. Even here where I am in Serbia, they're now talking about building a nuclear plant. We've got small modular reactors, which are a technology that are not as far away as people think from being deployed at a commercial scale. We've got giants like Amazon, Microsoft, Google. They're all interested in SMRs, and they're actually putting their money where their mouth is, and they're investing in that technology. So I think the stars are aligning for uranium. I think investors have been frustrated recently because despite all the bullish news of 2024, the equities have not performed as expected. The spot price of uranium, this is a very difficult thing about the uranium market. The main number that people look at is the spot market, which is much lower than people would like it to be or that they expected it to be at this point in time. The spot market is extraordinarily illiquid, extraordinarily thinly traded by a handful of traders, and it's the only real kind of real-time metric that we have. There's no real futures market to speak of. Long-term contracts are often very opaque and they have non-disclosure agreements attached to them. So it's often difficult to get information about what the true value of this commodity is. And it's extraordinarily volatile. I mean, if you cannot stomach volatility, then it's a trade you should absolutely stay out of. But if you can, and if you're willing to look at the long-term picture and not have, an end date in place. This is another problem with investors in general, is they allocate capital to commodities or to other kind of a bit of more speculative assets that they can't afford to lose. And so they're planning to retire. They want to put their kid through college. They want to buy a home. You shouldn't be putting that money into the uranium sector. But if you have the long-term view and you're willing to stomach that volatility, I think it's the greatest value proposition at the moment of any commodity in the world, which was a big takeaway for me from 2024 and moving into 2025 as well.
I remember sitting, Rick Rule, I always go to his conference in Boca. I wouldn't miss it. Before that, it was Vancouver. Sorry, I got 3 dogs in here, and they're a new puppy, and they're all getting to know each other. It's chaos, and of course, my wife left the 3 dogs in here with me. So I will apologize again in advance should we hear any more arguing between the 3. But I remember Rick always the first guy in the auditorium and the last one to leave. And I remember sitting in there at 6 a.m. and 2 years ago and having him say virtually the same thing that you just said about uranium being his pick. And as typically as Rick is, spot on and early, and done very well for people who have followed his advice. If I'm not mistaken, uranium isn't my bailiwick, but if I'm not mistaken, the majority of it is mined in Russia. You can correct me if I'm wrong. And yet
It's Kazakhstan. The majority, about 40% of enrichment capacity is in Russia, which is huge because uranium, you can't just mine it out of the ground and put it in a reactor. Outside of a very few types of reactors that exist, the vast majority of them, it has to be converted and enriched. And Russia controls most of that part of the fuel cycle. The vast majority of it is mined in Kazakhstan, but Kazakhstan is aligning itself more and more with Russia and with China as well. So, we've already seen a ban on enriched uranium come down in the United States, and then Russia kind of countered that by saying, you know what, it's like, you can't fire me, I quit type of situation. They said, well, we're going to ban, enriched uranium going to the United States anyways. How much influence does Russia have with Kazatomprom, which is the largest uranium producer in the world, located in Kazakhstan? They've been producing somewhere upwards of 30% of the whole world's uranium supply for several years now. So that is a huge geopolitical risk that could come into play as well.
For sure. And Kazakhstan being part of the Eurasian Economic Union, the president of Belarus has recently called for a summit between the Eurasian Economic Union and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and to meld them into the BRICS. I think they have quite a significant impact and influence over Kazakhstan. And conversely, if I'm not mistaken, there's only 1, maybe 2 operating uranium mines in the United States. I did notice recently, just right after the new year, that 3 uranium mines are to be open here now, or just recently. They're talking about building some more and operational. Are there opportunities for uranium, since we're going down this path here in North America, that you like? Of course, none of this is financial advice, but following your wisdom on this and your lead, do you see any opportunities for uranium mining in North America?
Yes, absolutely. So in terms of individual companies, the first thing that I will say is the vast majority of people should just be buying the SPUT ETF and calling it a day. SPUT, or URNM, which is an ETF that holds all of it's heavily weighted to Cameco and Kazatomprom, which are the 2 largest publicly traded uranium companies. They're the only 2 that are producing uranium in any sizable quantity. So I would look at those 2 ETFs as kind of like the ballast of a uranium portfolio. And then maybe if you want to speculate, or if you're willing to put the time and effort into researching the industry deeply, you can start looking at individual companies. But I will say, I think there's a big opportunity within America, especially because nearly 20% of the US's energy generation comes from nuclear power. And yet there is basically zero meaningful production occurring at present. You have Energy Fuels, which has recently started production at 1 or 2 of its mines, I believe, restarted production. Historically, they're one of the biggest uranium producers in America, second only to Cameco. Cameco also had operations in the US in the past. I'm not sure if they still do, but Energy Fuels has produced large amounts of uranium in the past. They've recently restarted production. They're going to be looking to ramp that up. So I think that's one area where you might look. UR Energy is, I think, one of the only other very small handful of companies actually producing uranium at present in the US, in Wyoming. And they're producing a very small amount, but also looking to ramp up production. I spoke to the CEO, John Cash, and he admitted very frankly that they're having challenges which are occurring all across the uranium sector right now, finding talent, because all of those people who have knowledge of uranium mining have either are either retiring or have already retired, and there has not been a large influx of new younger people who are interested in that industry, particularly because since Fukushima there was a very long bear market, and nuclear energy was reviled and called all sorts of bad names. So not a lot of people got into the industry. So that's kind of an industry-wide problem as well. But I think within the US, there's definitely some opportunities. Another point I want to make is the strategic uranium reserve. The US government has purchased uranium from Energy Fuels. Uranium Energy Corp is another company in the US that I think will do quite well and that I believe is producing at the moment, though not in sizable quantities, and a few other companies. So the government has already made a purchase of uranium. There's no talk about future plans to regularly purchase into the strategic reserve, but I think that's something that could occur. And I think if the government really gets behind domestic uranium mining in America, that there could be some great opportunities there. I'm hoping that Trump will also deregulate parts of the industry. The nuclear industry at present is way overregulated because of Fukushima and all these things that pop into people's minds. Chernobyl. I mean, people got to get over Chernobyl. That was run in the USSR, and it was run very poorly. It was a joint nuclear weapons manufacturing facility and nuclear power plant. The reactor design had all sorts of problems. I mean, it's amazing that people still look to that. And there was a whole television series made about it, which unfortunately just caused people to even more question nuclear. What about Chernobyl? It's insane that people even ask that. But I think we need to see some deregulation now because it's way too regulated. Nuclear reactors take way too long to build. The US does need more nuclear reactors. So that's what I would say on the US side of things. On the Canadian side of things, obviously you have Cameco. That's the home of Cameco, the largest producer besides Kazatomprom in Kazakhstan. So I would definitely look there. And barring that, you've got Next Gen Energy, which has the world's best undeveloped uranium deposit, by far highest grade, largest quantity. They are supposed to start production sometime in 28, 29. That's very unlikely. It's more like it's going to be 2030, 31. But I think when institutional money starts flowing into the space, which I think is going to occur at a bigger level than we've seen thus far, after the two big gorillas in the room, which are Kazatomprom and Cameco, NextGen is the next largest by market cap. So for institutions, that's going to matter. And when they look at the quality of the deposit, how big it is, the economics are also extraordinarily favorable. I think that could end up being a surefire bet. I'll leave a caveat there that NextGen has absolutely ridiculous G&A expenses. Management has been spending money on sponsoring F1 racing teams. They sponsored a hockey team. I mean, they put the NextGen logo on racing cars. Like, what are people watching F1 going to go, oh, I'm going to invest in an undeveloped uranium mine? It's completely insane. And they take so many actions that don't make sense. When I asked Rick Rule about this, he said it's despicable, it's disgusting, it's unacceptable, but they are just in a position where they can kind of get away with that. And as Justin Hune has said before, you just got to kind of hold your nose and buy in that situation, just because the deposit is insane, and they are going to be, I think, the beneficiary after Cameco and Kazatomprom when it comes to institutional money pouring into the space.
I mean, I hope people are understanding your depth of knowledge and all the way down to the minutia, from the big picture, the macro, down to the micro. The Commodity Culture channel, people must check it out, and your guests, because it's very obvious you know what you're talking about. You do your homework, and the people who you interview are backfilling it quite admirably. You have my respect just in the way you answered that question. So with the topic we just discussed of uranium, let's put that on the side for a moment and say, other than uranium, are there trends or ideas that your guests are constantly mentioning that you think people aren't taking seriously enough or aren't focusing on at all?
That's a really interesting question, because my guests tend to focus on a lot of the obscure stuff that most of the mainstream public doesn't pay attention to. But I would I would say, and this kind of comes back to the micro again, but I would say position sizing, if you'll allow me to kind of go there, because this is another issue that investors in the commodity space in particular seem to face, is that everybody's dreaming of 10 bagger or 100 bagger returns when that's extraordinarily unrealistic. The vast majority of mining companies, especially junior mining companies, are destined to fail. I would say like Brian Lundin and Rick Rule are the ones who really hammered this home for me, in that you have to allocate capital into the space, first of all, that you can afford to lose regardless of where you're putting it. And secondly, in such a way that you have a foundation to your house. So that could be either through an ETF, as I mentioned with uranium, that could be through royalty and streaming companies, which are a fantastic business model that essentially takes away so much of the risk that you face in the mining sector normally. You know, you take on just individual company risk in general, jurisdictional risk, all sorts of risk. The commodity price could be doing one thing or the other, and it could definitely affect the cost of production and thus affect the free cash flow and all of these types of things. But if you own a royalty or streaming company, they have made deals with a ton of these different mines. So, you know, depending on the size of the company, when you look at a Franco-Nevada or Wheaton Precious Metals, they've got streaming or royalty agreements with like 60 plus 100 plus different companies. And so you really reduce the risk. They kind of get all the upside benefit from those transactions, and they really mitigate that downside risk. So I think royalty and streaming companies are a great way to kind of mitigate individual company risk. And barring that, just the large producers. You know, I was talking about Cameco and Kazatomprom when it comes to uranium. Put the majority of your capital, if you're interested in a particular space and you want to invest in it, the majority of capital you invest in that space for the vast, vast majority of people should be in these kind of bellwether, more stable investments, and then speculate with smaller amounts of capital, because I see it all the time on X, people crying into their beer in the uranium sector. They're going, this sector hasn't done anything. I haven't made any money. In fact, I'm in the red 50, 60%. And they're just crying about it. And the crazy thing is, I started investing in uranium in early 2021, and I'm up. So I don't understand. These people are saying I got in 2016 and 2018 and 2020, and they're down. The reason is because they all took a gamble and they rolled the dice on these junior explorers. They had visions of sugar plums dancing in their heads, and they thought they're going to get 100 bagger return, and that it doesn't matter because the uranium thesis is so strong, it's going to generate a mania. And when a mania occurs, anything with uranium in the name is just going to go to the moon. And so I'd rather invest in a stock that costs 10 cents and can go to $1 than a stock that's $5 and could go to 8 or 10. And so within that, you run into some very big problems because it doesn't work that way. And so I think position sizing, it's not really a macro trend, obviously, but it's one of the biggest lessons I took away, and that I think I hope people would take away from the show as well.
No, I mean, I think what I'm taking away from this is that the questions that I prepared were wrong, all focusing on the people whom you've interviewed. I think you have risen to the acumen of the people you're interviewing. You have a massive, wide-ranging breadth of knowledge, and it's really refreshing to hear your take. My experience with you has been you interviewing me and watching you MC or interview others at the Vancouver Resource Investment Conference, as an example, where I'll see you next week. But it's very impressive, Jesse. I hope you never sell yourself short. You are no slouch as it pertains to the big picture. And for me, a lot of what I focus on is the macro. You seem to easily understand the macro while also doing your homework and understanding the micro. I hope people will pay attention to the sage advice you're giving and really go to your channel and listen to what you and your guests are saying. It's certainly suiting you well. If you could summarize again, and I almost feel bad falling back to questions about interviews. That is my only experience with you. But like I said, I should be asking you questions just about economics and commodities. And well, next time I have you on my show, I will. But since I've already gone down this path. If you could summarize the collective wisdom of your interviews, and again, the people that I see you interview in my mind are the best and the brightest in the world, and they have achieved success largely through experience and gray hair. And those are the people that you want to gather information from. And you've done just that. And you can see by doing that how it can transform or make you understand what's happening in the world. And that's why I wanted to focus on that a couple questions ago, how people can transform and understand the world, their own knowledge base, transform and understand the world a little bit better, because it is confusing right now. Things are upside down. We've lived through 4 years of bizarro world. So with all of that being said, if you could summarize the collective wisdom of all of your interviews into one key life lesson, or share one big takeaway from all of your interviews with all of these marvelous people, what would it be?
I think it would be that paying attention to geopolitics is very important. I think that the way that our world is shifting right now is something that is very significant, and that people don't seem to understand the significance. You know, the interesting thing is my channel's a commodities channel, but it kind of is also under the surface an anti-government kind of pro-libertarian channel. I talk to a lot of people like Martin Armstrong, Tom Luongo, and people like that who talk about the bigger picture. So I think it's very important to pay attention to the bigger picture, and that's a big lesson I've learned, and that's a big reason why I moved to Serbia and relocated here from Canada, because from a geopolitical standpoint, Serbia is allied with China, Serbia is allied with Russia. They're kind of sitting on two chairs, in that they're also talking about EU membership, but then they're also cozying up to the BRICS. And so they don't really have many direct enemies at the moment. In addition, cheap energy, because we're getting energy from Russia. We're not sanctioning Russian natural gas. So that looking at the bigger picture has helped inform what I'm doing in my own life. And I think people should kind of open their eyes to the world around them and consider the possibility of relocating where they are. You know, I speak to a lot of people who have also done that. People like Lobo Tigre, who are in Puerto Rico, people like Doug Casey, who's in Argentina and other places in the world. People like Francis Hunt, you know, he's moving all around also. I think there's a big value in that, in being ungovernable, paying attention to the world around you, what's happening in the geopolitical realm, what it could mean for you in your own life, and considering other jurisdictions as a potential way to diversify not only your finances in terms of putting your money in bank accounts in different jurisdictions, or opening a brokerage account and perhaps having investments in different jurisdictions, but also when it pertains to your own personal freedom, your own economic situation. I mean, taxes are way too high in many parts of the Western world for what you get. Crime is on the rise. I think it's worth considering and perhaps trying out, traveling around. I mean, not everybody has these means, you know, and a lot of people have an interesting viewpoint of, I'll stay in my country and I'll die for my country no matter what happens. Well, I'd rather be, you know, as a channel I like to follow called Nomad Capitalist, which I've actually been interviewed on, says, go where you're treated best. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I'd rather not get trampled on by my own government, get overtaxed, and get all of my tax money sent to fund Ukraine and gender ideology and whatever else that they want to do. I'd rather take my destiny into my own hands. And speaking to so many of my guests who have done that has helped me strengthen my own resolve in realizing there's a big world out there. There's so many options and opportunities. So I think it's worth opening yourself up to those.
Well, I know at some point along the way you met a lady from Japan, but you know, you're a young guy, and you say that, and it can go in one ear and out the other. You already told us that you were in, you know, in Asia with not a lot of money. What originally sent you from a home in Canada all the way over to South Korea and China? What, at a young age, and proficient enough to do travel channels, what sent you over there to begin with?
got such a, I'm going to summarize this as much as I possibly can because it's out there. So
I like
I,
out there. Out there's good, brother. We all like out there.
yeah, so I majored in acting for the camera in university. That was my course, and my dream was to become an actor. Did a couple small projects after I finished university, and then I became a hip hop artist. Strangely, looking at me, you would not know that, but I became a hip hop artist in Vancouver. Started putting on shows. Started getting involved with the Asian student community, and I had a really unique angle in that I was making friends with a lot of them and bring them to the show. So my shows would just be filled with these Asian students. So I started to connect with the Korean and Japanese and Chinese communities. And I got really into hip hop from South Korea. So I learned to rap in in Korean language.
Oh my
I
gosh.
became the first Westerner in history to appear on Korean national television, rapping in Korean alongside one of their big hip hop artists. We did a song together. So that was a big part of my journey to that part of the
You just
country was music,
blew my
actually.
mind, brother. My mind,
Yes.
I'm throwing all. I don't know where I'm going to go with this one.
Yeah, it's kind of another life. So I speak Korean fluently. It's the only language beside English that I can actually speak fluently. And so I got really involved in the music scene in both China and South Korea, doing hip hop music, collaborating with artists there. And then that also led me into the entertainment industry because I had that background in acting from university. So I was able to appear in some movies and some television programs, but then I kind of, my bread and butter ended up being hosting travel programs. So that was kind of, yeah, it was a very interesting time in my life. I feel like it's like another life that I've lived. Sometimes I feel like I should be dying soon. Like shouldn't I be near the end because I feel like I've done so much. So yeah, random and completely, it's related in that I was able to take the expertise in broadcasting and apply it to commodity culture. So it ended up being a really good fit, that I had that skill that I was able to leverage. But yeah, it seems like another world far away, but
Oh
it
man,
did
now
happen.
I mean, I don't even know how to even come up with something clever to say other than I would have loved to have heard that. I was just it reminds me of just watching the second season of Squid Games, and one of the actors
Yeah.
is a big South Korean rapper. And geez, you're gonna have to send me some videos of your past life. I want to see that. Much respect, and to teach yourself the Korean language is unbelievable. I mean, that's and I think this again is your story is emblematic in that, you know, we talk about economics and geopolitical things and all of these things, but in the end, life is what you make of it. And your broad experience, I think, has shaped the way that you look at things, making you every bit as qualified as the people to speak on this stuff as the people that will be speaking on stage, myself included, in Vancouver. I think maybe you've missed your calling and you should be on the other side. You should be where you are right there instead of always interviewing people. You're a breath of fresh air and a massive amount of knowledge with a set of life experiences that are amazing, including picking up and leaving and going halfway across the world as a hip hop artist. That wasn't ready for that one. I know I've taken 40 minutes of your time. I'm going to ask you one last question, and it's kind of a philosophical one because, you know, sometimes I feel like a buzzkill, and I wonder if you do as well, in the respect that so much of what we've talked about over the last several years has been reaction to or speaking of things in somewhat of a negative light. We can try and spin it, you know, maybe not as much as you are focusing on resource stocks along the way, but when you're talking about geopolitical events, when you're talking about precious metals, when you're talking about fiscal irresponsibility, when you're talking about, you know, borderline brain dead monetary policy, when you're talking about all of the ills that have happened to our country socially and morally and spiritually and all around the world, you start to sometimes, I think, realize there's a very fine line between pessimism and realism. And I think people don't always want to hear that type of rhetoric, whether it be true or not. And that's why so few people are prepared for what's coming, because they can't get out of the way of what they never see coming. So I guess the one question I would leave people with here and ask you would be, after all of your interviews, after all of your life experience, living all around the world, now in Croatia, God bless you, man. It's incredible.
In Serbia, but I lived in
I'm
Croatia
sorry,
before I came
in
here
Serbia
too.
now.
So yeah.
But after all of that, do you feel humanity is moving in a more positive or negative direction now? And if so, why?
I think it is moving in a more positive direction simply because a lot of the kind of sinister aspects of the political class and, unelected bureaucrats, policymakers were brought to light after the pandemic. I think it brought to light a couple things. One is the herd mentality of humanity hasn't changed. The madness of crowds, that famous book written in the 1800s about the tulip mania and the witch hunts, and looking back at that time was looking back. Nothing's changed about those aspects of humanity, unfortunately. Most people are not interested in holding themselves accountable. Most people want a parental figure in the form of the government to tell them what they should and shouldn't do and to take care of them. And they just want to not have to think too much about what's going on in the broader world. They'd rather entertain themselves or just do things that are fun in the moment. So it's almost like a child-parent relationship that most people have with their governments, particularly in the Western world, which is why I came to the Balkans, because here it's the opposite. People universally despise the government and do not trust it. And now that's because this is former Yugoslavia, which was a communist empire that collapsed in one of the most brutal and vicious wars in modern history, which was in the 1990s. That was yesterday. That just happened. It just happened. So people here do not want to go back to that, and they are very cognizant of government manipulation. It's interesting. In Canada, I always say the reason I like Serbia is because in Canada, when the Freedom Convoy was sitting around singing Kumbaya, Serbs were taking bricks and other weapons into their hands and throwing them at the police, and it built they rioted here. So it's a completely different culture. So, I think that it has woken up a lot of people. I think the Freedom Convoy movement did open some eyes. I don't want to disparage what they did. And I think Trudeau freezing people's bank accounts, I think the mandates throughout the Western world and throughout the whole world, really, because they tried them here. They tried them in Croatia, in Albania, in Bosnia, but it didn't work because people coming out of that, coming from a base case of I don't trust you to governmental authority were just immediately wary. Whereas in the West, people are like, oh my God, we're going to die. We need to do whatever the government says. However, so that's kind of the negative side, was that humanity hasn't changed much, and it is kind of it can be considered a cultural phenomenon. But I think things are moving in a more positive direction because of shows like this, of shows like mine and others who are talking about these issues. And social media, it can be a good and an evil. It's just a tool. But one thing that has happened, Elon Musk, love him or hate him, I happen to think he's not some benevolent person. He's working in his own self-interest primarily, but he did open up the X platform to allow free discourse on a variety of topics. And now we just saw Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook come out and give a video message saying, hey guys, all the fact-checking stuff we were doing that was highly politicized, we were censoring too much, so we're going to stop with the censorship. We're going to allow more ideas to be shared. So this is becoming more of a trend now. I think the pendulum will swing the other way. Unfortunately, it could swing too far the other way, because now we can have people who a lot of far right is a label that's being thrown around far too liberally these days. But we do have a lot of politicians on the exact opposite side now who are starting to gain popularity. And I think that's a good thing compared to what we've had in the past, but it could get out of hand in the opposite direction. So we're at a fascinating inflection point in history. I'm optimistic overall, but I'm also very cautious. And that kind of ties back into my last point. And be aware, Don't just sit back and hope everything's going to be okay. Be aware of what's happening in different parts of the world. What are the different politicians saying? The power balance between, the EU and the BRICS and the West, and how that's all playing out. Try to parse through all of the information, find out what's real, what's fake. The truth usually lies in the middle on these matters. So I think things are moving in a positive direction, but we need to remain vigilant. And people like me and you need to keep spreading the message that we need to hold these people accountable, these politicians, these unelected bureaucrats, these policymakers, who, by the way, most politicians who are calling the shots are, in my opinion, psychopaths, absolutely vile psychopaths at worst, and sociopaths, people with narcissistic personality disorder at best. So I think you have to kind of frame it in that lens and look at them through that lens, and their decisions start to make more sense when you do that. I'm not saying that's across the board, but I think that's come to light a little bit more, and the more people that are made aware, the sooner that we can hopefully move forward with more freedom of speech, more freedom of movement, less restriction by government.
Dude, you're beautiful. I mean, your answers are amazing. I didn't know how this interview would go based upon our history together, but I'm blown away by your depth of knowledge. It's quite admirable, and you have my respect. Did you pop a bottle of champagne the other night, not on New Year's, but when Justin Trudeau decided to step down?
No, because I think there's no reason to celebrate that. It would have been better if Justin Trudeau did not resign and ran against Pierre Poilievre in the election. That would have been something to celebrate, because Trudeau is so hated by even his own party and by the vast majority, I think, of Canadians. Even Liberal voters were very unhappy with him. So I think it's a bad thing for Pierre Poilievre's chances. And now the Liberal Party has a much stronger chance. I think they're going to take Mark Carney. They're going to put him up there in his nice suit. He's going to be the new voice of reason, saying, he's going to help with the economy. He's going to bring down inflation. He's going to say all the right things. But behind that mask, he's the same fanatical, far left ideologue that Trudeau was. And he's a socialist. And he's going to just keep putting Canada down the wrong path if he gets into power. So I did not pop a bottle. I shed a tear. I would have liked to see Justin actually get up there and run.
Well, look, it may not matter. They may be part of the United States in a few weeks anyway. So
yeah, exactly.
By the way, do you know what June 18th is?
No.
You don't know what June 18th is? Well, let me tell you what June 18th is, because in researching you like you do, I typed in Jesse Day and pops up. June 18th is National Jesse Day. Is celebrated every year on June 18th. The name Jesse is a popular name and blah, blah, blah.
Wow.
June 18th, every year, June 18th is
that in my
your
calendar.
day, brother. And they call it Jesse Day. I mean, and they couldn't even be more appropriate. So make sure you put that in your calendar. Tell your wife, tell your friends.
I will.
I will make sure and put it in my calendar and send you a happy Jesse Day to Jesse Day next June 18th. Dude, you made my day today. You're fantastic, and you do everything with a smile, which is even better. And I like that about you. How can people find out more about what you're doing and follow you, especially follow you, maybe not just the interviews you're doing, but like your Twitter, your X, follow you and your thoughts, which you've proven to me, and I hope everyone watching this, that are worthy of being followed.
Yeah, thank you very much. So obviously Commodity Culture on YouTube. I'm also one of the hosts alongside Jay Martin of the VRIC Media channel. I usually host 2-person panel interviews there, so you can just search for VRIC Media. My Twitter handle is at Jesse B. Day, Jesse B. Day. And I'm going to be teaching some courses. These are going to be going online. Jay Martin's Commodity University. I'm going to be teaching a Uranium Investing 101 course, and that should be available sometime in 2025. So keep an eye out for that as well.
That's really very cool, man. And I will make a shout out for VRIC. It really is. To me, there are two conferences I attend every year, and Jay Martin's Vancouver Resource Investment Conference is the first one of the year here next week in Vancouver, and then, of course, Rick's conference in my backyard here in Boca. But it is a fantastic show, one of the best, and great speakers, great people, great networking, and a great place to be, to visit Vancouver. Jesse, brother, Happy New Year. Safe travels to Vancouver. I do hope you'll make at least a couple minutes to, I see you on Twitter, and very often you're cheering with a martini or a beer. I hope you'll let me buy you one of those and pick your brain, because you've kind of expanded my mind, and maybe have you even, sing me a rap song or something in South Korean when I see you. But no, sincerely, you're one of the good guys, man. And doing things with a smile means a lot to me, because, sometimes the weight of the world gets a little heavy when you're trying to figure out what's going on. And you make me realize that in the end, we can only do what we can do. We should be informed and try to put on a smile. So thanks for making my day. Thanks for joining me. I look forward to seeing you in public in person real soon. And you take care of yourself, brother.
You too, buddy.
Thanks, man.
Little by Little with Andy Schechtman.